Hi, I am Michael Livingstone, and today I have the pleasure of presenting to you on the topic enhancing communication between healthcare professionals and law enforcement personnel for screening and assessment of mentally ill and justice involved persons with co-occurring disorders. This is a presentation that meets the requirement for a course called Public Health Practice 5201, Current Issues and Methodologies at Stockton University, New Jersey, fall 2024, where the course instructor is Dr. Anthony Disson. Now, in this presentation, I will highlight some of the keywords, and this presentation meets the requirement for cultural competency assessment. Now, cultural competency. Dealing with cultural competency of a reference group, which is mentally ill people, and the cultural competence of law enforcement persons and people who are not just mentally ill, but people who have co-occurring disorders. And what that means is people who have both a substance use disorder and an underlying mental issue. And how can they be competent? Well, we will see. So stick with me on this topic. Thank you very much in advance for your audience. So these are a few learning objectives that I would like us to put in mind in this presentation for today. My objective is to draw the theoretical framework behind cultural competence. What does it mean to be culturally competent? What's the theory behind it? I will try to draw a correlation between that by bringing in other theories that form the bulwark or the foundation for that, such as communicative competence theory. So we will apply communicative competence and we will talk about culture in systems. When we talk about cultural competence, it has to do with systems, departments, organizations. And then I'll also try to show and apply those theoretical frameworks to the particular reference group. What is called a reference group is the audience or the people that we're trying to study or target. These are justice involved people. In other words, they are criminal defendants, people who have committed crimes, misdemeanors, felonies. And these people are mentally ill. And these people have co-occurring disorders, which is substance use disorder or a mental illness such as schizophrenia, borderline, or major depression. We're going to look at the interaction between law enforcement. They have their own culture. Their culture is to bring justice and to protect the public. That's their goal, their value. The culture has to do with values. So that's their value, enforcing the law. And then the values of the mentally ill. Well, the mentally ill is mentally ill, which means that their values are distorted. So sometimes their psychosis can lead to crimes. Should we punish them for their crimes that they committed under mental illness? And then we're going to look at how the healthcare personnel, because you have to screen people to know whether they are actually, in fact, mentally ill or not. And these healthcare personnel also have their own culture. In public health, we say the goal is equity and optimal health outcomes. We want these mentally ill people to be well. That's the culture of the healthcare personnel in healthcare institutions. And they're dealing with interacting with law enforcement and mentally ill people. So we'll bring in the culture, and then I will also bring in the theoretical foundation of communicative competence, linguistic competence, as a foundation for cultural competence for this reference group of people. criminally involved, and mentally ill people with co-occurring disorders, and how the assessments and evaluation can be accurate, because communication is important for accuracy of outcomes. So I'll go to. So the ultimate goal of this presentation is to show cultural competence in this kind of setting. So we have to examine culture and what it is and what's the depth of it before we look at the competency level of it. Competence means that we basically know the levels of culture as well. Now, Dr. Edgar Schein of MIT is a scholar, a notable scholar on levels of culture at the organizational level and also at the individual level. He postulated this theoretical framework about culture, that there are 3 levels of culture. Whenever you're dealing with culture at the organizational level, especially, he has 3 layers of organizational culture. That is the artifacts, espoused values, and underlying assumptions. They have different levels of importance in shaping the actual culture of an organization. The first level, which is the artifacts, as you can see on the diagram, that's the surface. At the surface, it's like an iceberg. You see the top of the iceberg, but beneath the iceberg and the water, there are very deep things. That's where the real material is. So the first level, which is the surface, palpable level, is where you see artifacts and behaviors. Sometimes it reflects in logo or brand. As Dachshund, we say of osprey. Students have ospreys. So we have the character of ospreys. Okay. Now you go to Temple University, they use the owl. So Temple University students have to have the values of an owl. That's just the surface. So the artifacts, these are the surface level manifestations of an organization's culture, easily perceptible to anyone who steps inside. They are the visible aspects of culture, the things we can observe in an organization. Artifacts encompass tangible elements like office layout, dress code, logos, and rituals. For instance, a company that encourages a casual dress code signals a relaxed and innovative atmosphere. In the law enforcement department, you will see the police wearing their uniforms and carrying bulletproof and pistols, guns visible. That's part of culture. Artifacts. These artifacts influence not only the physical environment, but also the psychological climate within the organization. I mean, if a policeman walks in with guns and you see that an authority figure has just walked in, so things begin to change. If there's some kind of disorder, things begin to change a little bit. Simply because we saw something such as a gun and a police badge. Okay, so after the artifacts level, then you go to the espoused beliefs and values. The values, the beliefs that the organization has or the individual also has. The beliefs that's beneath the surface. Organizations have espoused beliefs and values that serve as guiding principles for decision making. When employees share these beliefs, it creates a sense of alignment. It aligns them. Law enforcement have beliefs that align them with their colleagues, and healthcare persons also have their beliefs that align them with their colleagues. It makes it easier to make decisions that are in harmony with the company's vision and values. This level of culture has a significant impact on how leaders shape corporate culture and how employees perceive and interact with one another. Now, this is very important, especially when you hear we're trying to communicate. 2 cultures are trying to communicate. You have law enforcement, police, justice department trying to communicate with another organization that has its own culture, which is the healthcare department that has its own culture too. The law enforcement people want to enforce the law and bring people to justice, even if they have to apply force. The healthcare professionals have a right, also have a value to always save lives. So when you come in together, collaborating to do something, that's where competency comes in. You have to be aware of the culture. That shows cultural competence, the cultures that are coming together to merge for a purpose. Now, from the second level, you go to the third level, which is assumptions, underlying assumptions. The deepest and most potent level of culture is comprised of basic underlying assumptions. These are the unconscious beliefs and values that are rarely expressed openly. You will not see it. They are not palpable. They are not on the surface. They are really very deep. These assumptions shape how individuals within organizations perceive the world, and they are often resistant to change. If you bring an organizational change, if we try to enhance communication between law enforcement and healthcare providers, personnel, there will be change issues and change management, and there can be resistance to change. And when you're dealing with mentally ill people that are also criminally involved, you want to bring them to change so that the goal is to prevent recidivism, repetitive commitment of the crimes. They are mentally ill, so they are in psychosis, and maybe they take a knife and they want to hit somebody or kill somebody under psychosis. But that's also a crime. That's a murder. We want to prevent the crime. So there will be a resistance to change because what is normal to you is culture. To a mentally ill person who is schizophrenic, hurting somebody can be normal to them, and that's their culture. But the policeman's culture is also to protect the public and bring the criminals to justice, punish them. And the healthcare professionals also have their culture to save lives and not to do any harm under the Hippocratic Oath. So you have a conglomeration of cultures, a bricolage of cultures. And to be culturally competent, a healthcare or public health person should be aware of how these things run very deep, what is normal to these three entities that will be communicating, and how we can enhance communication for optimal health outcomes for this particular reference group. So that leads me to define cultural competence, right? Now we know that you're dealing with a system. A system is basically when you have different units coming together. When you have different units such as departments coming together to work together, different cultures coming together to work together, that forms a system. Here at Stockton, you have the Department of College of Health Sciences, you have the nursing department, and I know that in this program, you have different faculty coming from different departments to teach this MPH program that is new. You have professors from the physical therapy department teaching in this program, for example, MPH. And you have professors also who are environmental health professionals coming to teach environmental health. So you have different people coming from different departments to coordinate, to collaborate, to form an alliance to do something. So cultural competence always exists within a system of people with different organizational cultures coming together for an outcome. So a public health person has to know who is culturally competent, has to know that now he's operating within a system, therefore he has to make certain compromises. Our goal and our value as public health professionals is to produce optimal health outcomes and equities, treating people equally. It's an egalitarian value that we have. In order for us to have that, we also have to embrace the fact that the other cultures may not have the same values. So when you have different systems, and this is very important because when something goes wrong, it means that we have to trace it to a unit in the system. Something happened somewhere in the system. That is why we didn't get the outcome that we want. If these mentally ill people with co-occurring disorders keep showing up to the courts, committing crime after crime, let's say gun violence, mass shootings, okay, murders. Today they are here for a DUI. Tomorrow they are here for an assault. The next year they are here for, and the underlying issue is there. Our goal is to prevent that so that we have optimal health outcome. But that's going to happen within a system. So we have to always go back to what, if something goes wrong and we are not getting the optimal outcomes that we are looking for, we have to go back to examine the system and look at what we did. That's why this topic is enhancing the communication. And here I argue that communication is the key for accuracy, and communication is the key. Communication is actually culture. Yes, communication is culture because communication is not just words, it's symbols, it's semiotics, symbols, nonverbal communication. Okay, so it has to do with communication. We can't have cultural competence without communicative competence, and I'll get back into that in the next few slides. So now we can basically define cultural competence now in this kind of dynamic. Cultural competence basically theoretically means it's a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, agency, or among professionals and enable that system, agency, or those professions to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. So that is why that this is so important that you are operating in a system. That's why we have health systems, Cooper Health System. Penn Medicine is a health system. It's no longer a healthcare organization. Health system. The US healthcare is a health system because you're dealing with different entities coming together with different attitudes and policies. And in healthcare, one of the 10 essential functions of public health is advocacy for policy. And you can't advocate for policy without at least going through the legislatures. So we bring into the legislatures, we bring in law enforcement, we bring in all those things, and then you become cultural competence. So cultural competence has to do with the competence of a system that contains different units, different departments, different cultures. And we learned in one of the readings that we had for this course, different model, I think about the 3 hours of humility. Now, and this is going to be very interesting because we have to embrace the different cultures of the different systems and unify all of them. In certain parts of Africa, if you coming up with a meeting, you bring in a meeting, culturally, they follow what is called a polychronic time, not a monochronic time. If you want people to meet at 3 p.m., you have to set the meeting at maybe 12 p.m. because they're going to show up instead of 3 p.m. that you want the meeting, they will show up maybe around 6 p.m. They are not in a hurry for anything. That's their culture. That's what is normal to them. Okay, deadlines. No, it doesn't mean they are stupid. They like to relax. As they walk, they are collectivistic culture, collectively. As they walk to a meeting, they want to greet everybody and say hi to them and how they are doing. And that's going to take time. If you bypass somebody and you don't greet the person, it means that there's a grudge between the two of you. So you have to wait, greet, find out how their children and how their livestock is doing. Otherwise, the community will call a Sanhedrin, okay, and say, hey, we felt something is wrong when you bypass this person and you didn't even greet this person. And we don't want that. Okay, so when you come in the Western culture, everything is like strict, time, like robots, cut and dry. So you bring in law enforcement, nurses, and health professionals in this context with the mentally ill people. You have to accommodate the culture of the mentally ill people too. You have to be ready for scatolia, people who drink or people who are mentally ill and they play with fecal matter. You go to Camden, walk around transportation center, you see that there. And it shouldn't offend you. It's your culture not to be offended by sectors, but to be culturally competent, you have to be ready for that and not stigmatize and not condemn and not judge. So that is why it is a competence within a system and it will require compromises. Now, another aspect, a theoretical aspect of cultural competency is linguistic competence. Now, this is now a well-settled argument among communication professionals and theorists. Noam Chomsky, he said linguistic competence is not the same as communicative competence. Now, the cultures have to communicate, but how are they going to communicate without linguistics? If you are a healthcare professional, for example, now these days things have to be interpreted into Spanish. If you're dealing with a criminally ill, justice-involved person who is a Spanish-speaking defendant, you must have an interpreter if you speak English. Words mean different things to them. Jargon. In the healthcare profession, we use a lot of jargon. The police, they have their own jargon too. Law enforcement persons, they have their own jargon. Now, if you're doing clinical assessment, mental health assessment, evaluation, screening, the language or the tool that is being used and the questions that are being asked to the reference group, the mentally ill person with disorders, they have to be able to understand what is being said. And that is linguistic competence. So linguistic competence is not the same as communicative competence. And it's not the same as cultural competence. But you can't have cultural competence without linguistic competence and communicative competence. And that's so important to understand in this particular setting whereby we want to enhance communication. Linguistic theory is concerned primarily with an ideal speaker-listener relationship in a completely homogeneous speech community. The language perfectly is unaffected by such grammatical irrelevant conditions as memory, limitations, distractions, shifts of attention and interest, and errors, and applying this knowledge of this language in actual performance. That was by Noam Chomsky. And I'm sure everybody knows that scholar. But the debate is linguistic competence the same as communicative competence? Just like I'm speaking English to you, just because I'm able to speak English fluently doesn't mean that I'm communicating effectively. So we will look at communicative competence as well as part of the foundation for cultural competence. So now we move to communicative competence. This is what Canary and Cody, two scholars in communication, have said what constitutes communicative competence. Just because somebody is communicating doesn't mean they are competent. Competence has to do with application, okay? And the knowledge that you have and applying it, knowledge about culture, be awareness. There's a six criteria for assessing communicative competence. Basically, it has to be adaptability, conversational involvement, conversational management, empathy, effectiveness, and appropriateness. When you're dealing with mentally ill people, some of them is because of post-traumatic stress disorder, there are triggers, okay? I know somebody who had a post-traumatic stress disorder, and whenever he hears the sound of any construction, somebody even hitting anything against a wall, they may get into a meltdown. And they'll start shouting and screaming and yelling, and they can't sleep all night. So there are triggers. You have to be appropriate. So when you're doing a screening, if a healthcare professional is screening a mentally ill person who has post-traumatic stress disorder, they have to be aware of that mentally ill person's culture, which is what is normal to them, what runs deep down, as we saw from Edgar Sheen, their assumptions, okay, what is appropriate to them, their beliefs. It's not appropriate at that time to bring certain things that will remind them about their trauma. You have to be trauma informed. You know, you don't use certain words. I know a certain professor, when I was doing my undergrad, he has hyper anxiety. So whenever he steps into a classroom, biology classroom, and he's teaching, he will take 4 apples and put them on the table in front of the whole class, a class packed with about 100 students. And he would grab an apple to eat whenever a student asks a question and uses a word that triggers his trauma from the military. You see him grab the apple and then be chewing it in the microphone aloud. And you wonder why. But that is his way of managing the trauma based on a trigger word that was used. So linguistic competence means you're able to say those words, ability to say. Like, for example, I have an accent. There are certain words I can't say them, but I have to be able to say them. Okay, that's Noam Chomsky, as we saw. Be able to speak and say them. But saying it is not enough. If you say it, it has to be appropriate to that person who is receiving the message so that you can get the necessary feedback from the person. Conversational management. So you have to manage the conversation when you are screening or evaluating a mentally ill person. Okay, if it's a homicide, you don't talk about blood. You have to use a certain word differently, maybe titer, Titer, instead of using the word blood, because during the atrocious attack, there was blood, and that will remind the person of that, and you have a meltdown or a psychosis. So communicative competence means that the true professions that are coming together to screen and evaluate the mentally ill person with co-occurring disorder must adapt their message. They must use appropriate words and manage the conversation. If they realize that the person is psychotic and not mentally competent to answer certain questions, then their competency is compromised. Of course, the attorney is going to step in and say, you should have cut off the conversation when you saw that the person was not competent. The judge is going to postpone the trial and say, unless this person is competent, because that's their due process, they have to know what is facing them. Their rights are involved, even though they are mentally ill. They have rights. They have due process rights. They have constitutional rights. And they are innocent until proven guilty. We don't want crimes. We don't want people to hurt themselves. That's health profession and the law enforcement. But these things will come up during the evaluation, the screening. And so it has to be adapted. They have to have empathy when they are talking to those people like that. Because sometimes law enforcement that are not trained will understand that mentally ill people have triggers, may not have empathy, and they may not be cooperative. You say a certain word and they will respond with a curse word. So you have to have empathy and not say this person is just resisting me. And so I'm just going to handcuff the person and give them certain dirty slaps until I get the information from them. Now, that's communicative competence applied in this setting. Adapt the message. Now, still, to build more competence, we also have to have more theory, theoretical foundations, so that we reason within theoretical frameworks. One of the theories, fundamental theory that every professional, all of us, need to always put this in mind is the communication model. One of the profound models was by Harold Laswell in 1948. He came up with this model of communication. Who is saying what? In which channel? To whom? With what effect? Who is saying what? In which channel? To whom? With what effect? Now, this model is so important, and this is why ability to communicate or say words doesn't make somebody an effective communicator. Even people with PhDs in communication, professors in communication departments with PhDs behind their name in communication, it doesn't make them effective communicators. Because this is an art, and you always, always have to master this art. And this theory, for example, in this setting whereby we want to enhance the communication between law enforcement, so during the assessment and the screening of the mental status of the defendants, the criminal defendants, it is the health profession that's going to ask the health-related questions to examine their mental status. So who here is the healthcare profession? That's the person, the source of the information. Okay, he's going to the person that person, the healthcare profession, is going to be encoding the message. What is being said, the content is what was said, the message. And they have to tailor it through a channel of communication, that's the medium. And that is also an art. Whatever is being said, was it said through an interpreter? You know, when a message has to be interpreted by another third-party interpreter to the recipient, which is the criminal defendant or mentally ill person. Is it going to be the same message when it gets to the recipient? It may not. So the medium of communication is also important. The channel of communication is very important. Whether you're using a memo or in person. That's why sometimes there are things that we want to say. We don't use email to say that. That's a channel. Email is a channel. A culturally competent person has to be aware of channels of communication so that you know that when to use an email, when to use an in-person conversation, and when to use maybe a media such as a YouTube or a tutorial or something like that. That's what makes the person culturally competent, aware, to decide the proper medium to use. To who, based on who is receiving the message. And the effect is going to leave on the recipient. So the source of the information has to always gauge the end result of what I want to produce, the outcome I want to produce. I want to see the mental status of this person. That's the effect. I want this person to answer me with all accuracy. That's the effect. I want this person to stop, to get to the point of behavioral change. That's the effect. So based on the effect you want, law enforcement sometimes will become assertive and tell the person, stop. Okay? With one word, nothing else. Stop. With a pause. If you say stop, and then you start saying, stop. I told you, stop. You see how it's going to be interpreted. because it will leave an effect. Put the knife down. Put your hands behind your back. That's a command. It is not a friendship communication. In that setting, you're dealing with a mentally ill person who is a criminal defendant. So sometimes you have to give orders. So to enhance communication between these people during assessments, sometimes they have to know when to use a command and when to talk like friends so that they can get a buy-in to get information for accuracy of the assessment and the screening to determine what to do. And that's important because sometimes you want to put people under probation, parole, or under a mental health court diversion program that will treat them and bring them to the point of, the mental health issue going away so that they also stop committing the crimes. And this is why it is important to know the model of communication whenever in a setting or talking to somebody. Now, the other diagram at the bottom, as you can see, you can enlarge it later on. I would encourage you to post it somewhere that you can always see it whenever you're communicating. As you can see, there are filters. Communication is not complete unless there's feedback. The recipient of the message also has to translate and then give you feedback. The feedback will determine whether they actually understood what you said through that channel. Now, if the feedback that you're getting from the person is not the same as expected, then it means the law enforcement professional or the healthcare professional who is doing the screening has to pause and examine the channel of the communication. Sometimes when the healthcare professional is asking or doing assessment and the policeman is standing right there, okay, that's an authority figure. The criminal defendant, who is a mentally ill person, already has memories about the arrest or the atrocity. So the presence of the authority figure there makes them resistant. So you have to now say, oh, this channel of communication, this has to be said by the policeman, not me, the healthcare professional. Or I need a policeman to be standing here, or they have to go while I assess this person. Or you're drinking, you can still drink, it's up to you. But when you are ready to change and to get sober, we are willing to help you too. You see that kind of message? It's like not saying, hey, you have to stop drinking. You have to stop drinking, getting drunk and driving. You're going to kill somebody. No, they have to see it for themselves. They have to see it for themselves. So during the screening, you're going to find out what's their mental state of mind at the time of the crime. If somebody was in a DUI, why were they in the car with alcohol in their system? What was their intent? What did they intend to do? Was it for entertainment? Or maybe they had a mood swing. A bipolar person has mood swings. Suddenly they are happy, suddenly they are down. And some people, they want to swing their mood back, so they drink and swing it back. You want to find out these things so that you can get to the point of knowing that this person is a bipolar person who has mood swings. And until you deal with the bipolar, the person is going to keep having the drunk driving, which law enforcement doesn't want, and definitely health professionals don't want. See, so that's the challenge, and that's why competence and cultural competence, knowing this theory and communicating with this theoretical framework in mind, will enhance the communication for accuracy of information, because that's the feedback. We want to get to the bottom, which is, as Edgar Shen says, the bottom, they are underlined the deep-rooted issues. Because unless you lay the axe at the root, you are just scratching the surface and they'll keep coming back with the same issue. And that's why we have what is called recidivism. And the question now goes to the healthcare or the criminal law enforcement people. Didn't they know that this person has already a record of DUIs or murders or assault? And why did they let the person go out? this person should be kept outside of the public until they are fully treated. You see, so that's the outcome and the goals that we want. So we have to enhance the communication so that we get the proper feedback for behavioral change. This part is where we have to understand the people communicating, the law enforcement and the healthcare professionals who are dealing with a mentally ill person have to understand the reference group. As we saw in the previous model, communication model, who is saying what to whom? The recipient. The recipient, you have to be aware that they are justice involved. They are also mentally ill. And their communication has to change. Now, because there's a process during the screening and evaluation, there's inferential thinking. You have to avoid drawing inferences quickly and decision-making very quickly. You have to arrive at a decision as to what really may be the problem, the underlying problem that this person is having. Is it grief? Maybe they lost their loved ones, and that's how they react. They resort to alcohol, drink and drink and drink, because they think the substance will give them the happiness. And everybody's reaction to grief is different. Trauma is relative. Trauma is relative. What may be traumatic to me may not be traumatic to somebody. If my parents die, I don't care. Because to me, my true parents is God. God made me. I believe that. But again, beliefs, other people don't believe that. Other people are atheists. They don't see God in anything. You see? So you have to get to the bottom line, and that's why we have to go to the root of the culture. Comparing themselves with their cultural group. It is because culture determines how we assume about, recognize, and interpret the health of the person. Although people have similar symptoms, the reported scores might be different due to the conflation of cultural factors in one's cognition. Indeed, this is a phenomenon that has been described in many studies, showing different levels of responses to specific psychological tests. If you do a cognitive behavioral test, that tool, it's question and answers. It's not like a laboratory test where you take a blood sample, CBC count, and it's going to tell you if the white blood cells are high or if they are low, then you draw that inference. Here you use a question and answer, so they have to be accurate. And you have to get the accurate, but there are conflation of culture on the mind of the person. So they have to be aware to enhance communication between these people. You have to be aware of the reference group that is being dealt with. Who is receiving the message? They are mentally ill and they are justice involved. You can apply this even in normal settings. There are places that Philly Eagles Philadelphia people don't want to hear about Jersey Devils. They are rivals. You have to be aware of the history between people, places, states. That's the reference group. So cultural competence of a healthcare professional, a public health professional, who wants to obtain the optimal health outcome or equities, has to be aware of the reference group for accuracy of results. Okay. So now we get to the real applying these theoretical frameworks to the intervention in public health or in medicine or healthcare. There are always interventions. The interventions or the instrument that's being used is screening. It's screening the reference group for their mental status. So what then is screening? We have to look at the policy again. as Edgar Shen says, culture has to do also with policies. Organizational culture has to do with policies. And policies are informed by authorities. So in public health, one of the authorities when it comes to co-occurring disorders, substance use disorders, is the SAMHSA. SAMHSA, those are the acronym. It stands for Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. It's a federal instrumentality when we study about the organization of the governmental public health system in the United States. SAMHSA falls under the Secretary, Deputy Secretary, Chief of Staff, and the operations divisions, the health department, just like the Food and Drug Administration is an authority, just like the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, just like the operation, all those are operation divisions. National Institute of Health, SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, is also an operating division when it comes to substance use and mental health services administration. So we look at the policy or the culture there, and it's informed by SAMHSA. So to be a culturally competent person in this setting, you have to go back and look at the policy. The policy. What is screening? How is screening defined? Screening, according to SAMHSA, is a routine process of gathering or compiling information about justice-involved person towards the ends of identifying markers, indicators, or red flags for mental illness, addictive substance use, or other issues that palpably suggest the individual's need for appropriate treatment, for alternative general of supervision, or appropriate placement in housing or institutional settings. Again, social determinants of health. If you want optimal health outcomes, then we have to inculcate, consider, gather enough information to see what determined their health status to this point and what interventions can be given, such as maybe free housing. If you're going to treat a mentally ill person who is committing crimes, maybe the person is homeless. So now there's a housing first policy, which was in one of my reflection papers. You have to give them housing first before you can implement mental health treatment for them. If they are laying on the side of the street, maybe at water around transportation center, if you go there, you see a lot of people like that. We can't get the outcome that we want. So that's where public goods come in. So screening is what these persons, the police and the health persons are going to be doing. They are going to be screening them to determine their mental health status for co-occurring disorders. And it's information gathering, and it's a communicative competence issue. Screening is very important because it helps to make accurate determinations about the necessity of a more comprehensive assessment when performed in the nascent or beginning processes, so that screening results can be informative too about the necessity of diagnosis. After screening, during the screening, as we said, the questions that will be asked should be appropriate. They should be adapted, putting in mind the reference group. Now, screening is not the same as evaluation or assessment. Screening is not the same as evaluation or assessment. SAMHSA, again, defines those things. And the persons who are doing the screening or evaluation have to know when to do a screening and when to do an evaluation. So again, the difference between screening and assessment. SAMHSA says assessment is a process that is subsequent to screening. So screening comes before assessment. Assessment is defined by SAMHSA as a more comprehensive process of evaluating a justice-involved person for co-occurring disorders by using clinical interviews that can include holistic diagnostic methods such as psychological, laboratory, or other testing, such as gathering collateral information from family, friends, and other people who interact in close proximity with the justice-involved individual. Assessments is typically performed by a professional who is trained, licensed, or certified provider of mental health and substance use treatment services. Assessment is important because assessment of co-occurring disorders provides comprehensive examination of psychological needs and problems around the parameters of severity of mental and substance abuse disorders. Some people are just casual drinkers, occasional drinkers. I don't drink alcohol at all. It doesn't make me a better person than people who drink alcohol. So you want to assessment will determine whether the person is just an occasional drinker who ended up just going to maybe a party and drunk and drove, or he intended to drink just to hurt themselves, sit in the car, drive, hit her garage, and kill herself. Meaning, drunk and drove to commit suicide. That was the intent. That is where assessment comes in. Why the person did what they did, their intent. If the person has severe dependency on alcohol, then that one was habitual. This person is addicted. Therefore, we have to bring in addiction interventions, such as motivational interviewing, to evoke behavioral change. And then see the problems affecting the treatment. It also helps with the treatment assessment. So that is the difference between screening and assessment. And a culturally competent public health professional has to know these two tools whenever they are doing an assessment or screening for a mentally ill person as who is justice involved. Now, this is easy, but it's also not easy because you have to look at the filters inside the communication model. There are challenges on accuracy of information. When you're doing screening or assessment, you want the information to be accurate. During the assessment, if the person gets a meltdown and starts using curse words and insulting, or they are standing in court, they are answering questions accurately, and suddenly they flip out, turn to the judge, and then say, yo, get out of here. And he's pointing to the judge instead of saying, Your Honor, Your Honor. Instead, he turns around, the person turns around and points to the judge and says, yo, dude, I'm talking to you. Get out of here. You see? So there are challenges. And so because of these challenges, inadequate staff training can be a hindrance of accuracy of information. Time constraints in conducting screening. It doesn't have to be rushed. You have to have the time. If we realize that the mentally ill person is not competent or giving you competent answers, they are answering accurately. What's your date of birth? Date of birth provided. Are you married? No, I'm single. How many siblings do you have? I have 2 siblings. I have a stepfather. Okay. And then the conversation is going on. And then the person answers the question and they want to talk about their stepfather. Oh, I remember my stepfather. We used to go on a hike. And during the hike, we went on a fishing and we caught a big bass. Allow the person to say all that. Just have to have active listening. Listen to everything they have to say. So time constraints can be a hindrance to efficacy of conducting screening and assessment. And the culturally competent person who is dealing with this reference group has to have time. If it's going to take all day, allow that. Never cut off the person unless you realize that the mentally ill person, their state of mind has changed. If they start talking about maybe swallowing a pair of scissors, I took a pair of scissors and wanted to swallow it. What does that mean? You still have to listen without passing any judgment. You also have to look at the previous results of screening and assessment. If the person has had that, which have been conducted under suboptimal conditions or by untrained staff who may not be aware of unique issues related to co-occurring disorders, incomplete, mislabeled, or misleading clinical or criminal justice records. Okay. The transparent nature of screening and assessment instruments, may lead to individuals providing false information. That's why the person doing the screening and assessment has to at least build some rapport, and without having the policeman standing right next to them like that, because they have to provide. The risk is false information. If it is false information, do you still drink? Well, if the person is facing DUI, they may say, well, I stopped drinking, I'm sober. That's false information. That's information that has to be gathered from family members or whoever the person lives with, such as a fiancé or a relative. Do you know if your brother or your sister or your fiancé still drinks? Is the alcohol still a problem? Yes, still keeps bottles of alcohol in the car. Such a person can give accurate information if they are against the person's behavior. But if you, as a criminal defendant, mentally ill person, who is facing justice, whether they still drink and where do they keep the bottles of the alcohol, they will not give you accurate information because they feel they will be punished. Already they are facing justice. But we want restorative justice, and that's the outcome for health, optimal health outcome. Now, offenders may also anticipate negative consequences related to disclosure of mental health or substance use symptoms. So, as we saw from Edgar Schein, people have different beliefs and culture. What is normal to them is your culture. What is normal to you? So, we tend to be judgment, pass judgment quickly. Here, I don't drink. I've never been drunk before. Never, ever in my life. So, but when I'm dealing with somebody who is severe dependency on alcohol, I have to get out of that mindset and look at the person cognitively. And that's where cultural competence comes in. I have to look at the person sitting in front of me cognitively, not with prejudice. Oh, this person has lost their mind. Why would you even put alcohol into your mouth and sit inside of a car? That's judgment. Of course, we know they don't have to do that. But during screening and assessment, that's not what should be done. That's culturally incompetent. Also, the symptoms may also be feigned. If the person shows up for the assessment, maybe they've been taken to custody for a few days and they've been sober for a while, or their psychosis has gone down, their bipolar symptoms are gone down, or they have, assuaged. It can also lead to inaccurate results. So those are some of the hindrances or the challenges that the culturally competent police officers and health professionals who are assessing or evaluating screening a mentally ill person has to put in mind to enhance communication during those interventions. Okay, so now we understand what is going on. To enhance the communication, you have to overcome the challenges the noise, as we saw from the communication model. You have to overcome the noise in between the channels. So one way to do that is to increase staff training, provide staff training in the screening and assessment of co-occurring disorders within the justice system. This training should address signs and symptoms of mental and substance use disorders, how symptoms are affected by recent substance use, strategies to engage offenders in the screening and assessment process, cultural considerations in conducting screening and assessment, approaches for enhancing accuracy of information compiled, implementation of risk assessment, use of evidence-based screening, and diagnostic instruments. You have to make sure they are not giving false positives or true negatives, and use of assessment information to develop and update individualized treatment case plans and diagnostic instruments, and use assessment information to develop and update individualized treatment case plans. So their case plans or case management should always be updated based on information that is being, and it has to be individualized, not conjectural. That is part of being culturally competent. So the police and the healthcare professionals have to communicate whenever there's assessment and evaluation of a mentally ill person who is also justice involved, is being screened or evaluated. We established that. How do they communicate, and what channel of communications are they going to use to enhance the communication for accurate results and accurate feedback? One way they can use is by meetings. They can meet with the person, the person, the criminal defendant, mentally ill person. Or they can do video conferencing, or by telephone if they have to call people in the person's inner circle. Where were you when this happened? Why did you leave this person, knowing very well that this person has this disorder? They have to use written communication and timeliness of the information that's being gathered between the healthcare professional and the criminal. If the policeman took the person into arrest, he got a warrant, arrested the person, put them into custody, but then he has not written his criminal complaint or report already, because the evaluator or the assessor has to read the criminal report and then ask certain questions without passing a judgment, because the judge is the one who has to pass a judgment, not the assessor and not the screen, but the medium that they are going to use, medium of communication is going to use. So these are the suggested ways that they can use to enhance the communication between police and the healthcare professionals. Meetings can be formal and informal meetings between prison officers when transferring prisoners from one facility to another. There was an escaped prisoner in Pennsylvania, Calvert County. How that happened, it could have been a communication issue inside the prison. This can include two or more internal stakeholders, because framing interactions with others in the form of meetings might help to stay focused on progress of the prisoner, such as opportunity to get things done. External stakeholders also, meeting with them, may consider experts witness, a forensic psychologist, passionate and enthusiastic to use meetings to get people excited, because lack of excitement can be a hindrance. Lack of excitement can be a hindrance when doing those kind of communication. You have to apply good interpersonal communication is very important for effective meetings, such as wit and humor as an icebreaker during all meetings. The other medium that can be used is video conferencing. This can be another useful method prison officers can use to communicate with their colleagues in different geographic locations or systems to which the prisoners are being transferred. It can permit employees and prisoners to conduct real-time meetings, live video or audio images can allow geographically dispersed teams and stakeholders to see, hear, and talk with each other without being in the same location physically. If physical, direct, in person, without computer-mediated communication is necessary, that is a judgment call. Or you can use telephone. This is quite an archaic and reliable communication method that has been around for a long time. Telephones will always be with us. It can be used as an efficient method to communicate with the prison officers. Some of them may be the health providers because psychiatrists actually in prisons today providing psychiatric care. The mere ringing of a phone can prompt immediate response by the recipient in any part. So telephone is a good way, or written communication. There's another viable method that prisoners can use when transferring prisoners. Prison officers can use that when transferring it. It can take the form of a letter, email, instant messaging, organizational periodicals, and any other method that conveys written words or symbols. Prison officers can also use letters, PowerPoints, text messaging, social media, and blogs to communicate between one system to another to avoid loss of information. Again, key here is also loss of information. Loss of information at the police department and loss of information at the court that is managing the case, or loss of information at the district attorney's office or somewhere else. And that can be a problem. During the COVID, they had that because of the COVID and social distancing. A lot of prisoners had to be released from the prisons, but they have to have information there so that they can track how they are doing outside after they are being integrated into the public. So those are some of the ways to enhance communication between these two entities or departments, accuracy results and optimal. Now, in this diagram that you see on the screen, this is what is called the intercept model in criminal justice. The intercept model was also provided by the SAMHSA. Like I said in the previous slides, it's an authority, it's a policy, it's a sequential intercept model. It's a conceptual model that has become a heuristic framework for communities to organize targeted strategies for individuals with serious mental illness who are involved in the justice system. It provides criminal justice system plenty of intercept points or myriad of opportunities for connecting people involved with the justice system to appropriate services to stultify perpetration of criminal justice, of crime and risk. It's a linear model. Now, in this intercept model, as you see, it means you are intercepting at every stage of the process that after making an arrest. Sometimes the people who show up have the police officers, they have city training, so they know how to handle a mentally ill person and when arresting such a person. Right there, they have to do a screening. And then the screening may determine whether they have to go for an assessment. If they didn't do a screening when they did their arrest, then they have to note that, and then that screening will have to be done at another level. So the intercept model, basically, as you can see, starts with 0. And then it goes to intercept 1, intercept 2. That's law enforcement. Law enforcement has to still try to see whether the person is mentally ill, insane or not insane. It's interception. And then there's also the initial court hearings or initial detention, whereby you go for a preliminary hearing or an arraignment. Then the DA also say, okay, go do a CRN report, or let's see this person will qualify for accelerated rehabilitation because we feel the person was mentally ill when based on certain symptoms that the person showed during the arrest. And then they can proceed from there. If at that point they still didn't get anything and realize that the person had any mental issues, the goal here is to detect it, catch it, and then intervene, apply a proper intervention so that the person doesn't keep coming back, committing crimes, recidivism. So intercept 2. Then you go to the jails. If the person is put into jail, if the crime committed is tantamount to jail time, they go to jails. In the jail officers also have to do their screening and assessment and/or assessment. And if the court hearings or the initial detention or during the arrest, they all missed it, that this person has mental health issues, mental illness, they may be in the jail, they will detect it and be able to apply the proper intervention, which is maybe a psychiatric intervention. Because the jail, putting the person in jail, that's holding them accountable for their crime. But can you really hold a mentally ill person accountable for their crime? That's why you put them in jail. They'll get out, and 2 days later, they are back again, committing a worse crime. The jail will not treat the underlying issue. So you have to go. And then the next thing is, even if the person is released from jail, then you still have to do another assessment and intervention at re-entry and at re-exit. There are corrections facilities. Then they also do their assessment. Even when the person is released, check-ins, there has to be any mental health. Because we feel the person was mentally ill when it's so this is another dimension of being culturally competent when dealing with that particular reference group. The assessment after screening, right? As we learned, screening will determine whether you need an assessment. The assessment has to be integrated or blended. This is why, because the person is somebody who may have co-occurring disorder. Co-occurring disorder means that there are 2 disorders happening at the same time, simultaneously. The person may have a substance use disorder, such as alcohol use disorder, or drugs use disorder, regulated substances, and a mental illness disorder. Now, you have to assess for both of them because they are co-occurring. It means that both disorders, part of this, have to be treated at the same time. If you treat one without treating the other, then the other one will create. That's why some people have therapists and psychiatrists at the same time. And that is why some people have nutritionists, for example. Some people have bulimia and they also have bipolar. Bulimia, treatment, nutritionist, but bipolar is for psychiatrists. So blended, once you detect that the person has co-occurring disorders, then it has to inform the treatment as to how to also treat the person. Blended for integrated treatment with blended assessment. Samsha says that integrated or blended screening assessment approaches should be used to examine co-occurring disorders in the justice system. Because in the absence of specialized instruments to address both disorders, an integrated screening approach typically involves the use of a combination of mental health and substance use instruments. Integrated screening and assessment approaches are associated with more favorable outcomes among people in the justice system and in the community. So this is the point of making it blended so that you can have different treatment providers and not just put the person into jail or put the person on probation, but also have a court-mandated treatment. People with schizoaffective disorders, that's people who are schizophrenic, and at the same time, they also have borderline or bipolar. Yes, schizophrenic and bipolar, those are schizoaffective. And so those people have to be treated by a psychiatrist. But then they also may have an alcohol or substance use disorder, and that has to be treated by a psychologist. So you have both of them. So you have to do assessment for both of them so that you can now integrate the treatment for different professionals. And that also requires cultural. All right. So thank you so much for staying with me. And this is my conclusion, that to enhance communication for accuracy of information during screening and assessment of mentally ill or justice-involved persons by police and healthcare professionals or persons, they have to be culturally competent by operating within the policies, which is their culture, not passing judgment, and putting those theoretical foundations in mind. Communicative competence, linguistic competence, and all of that equals communicative, cultural competence. Thank you very much. Okay, class, thank you so much for staying with me in this presentation. I hope that this was beneficial to you and to your profession. If you ever have to deal with a mentally ill person, a loved one, or a family member, then you may find this useful. Thank you very much. What questions do you have? Let me know.